Hi all, welcome. My name is Dr. Nabil Tweme and I'm Senior Research Associate at Springtide Research Institute, where I research all things related to young people, religion, and spirituality. I'm so excited to be here talking with you all today about some of the findings of Springtide's latest report called Navigating Injustice, a closer look at faith, race, and mental health. Hi, Cassandra. I'm so glad to be joined by you today. Cassandra Ogbevere is from Springtide Research Institute, where we get to work together. And we're also joined today by Megan DeWalt from Princeton Theological Seminary. And I think we just got a request to join us now. How are you doing, Cassandra?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm great.
How's everyone doing? Hey.
Hey.
Hi, Megan.
How are you?
Great. I'm so glad to be here with you two today. So I just introduced myself, so I'd love to kind of hand over the floor to you all to introduce yourselves too.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cassandra Ogbevere, and I'm currently serving as the 2022-2023 BIPOC Springtide Research Fellow. And actually, I'm also an alum of the Institute of Youth Ministry at Princeton Theological Seminary as well. So I feel like I'm in good company this afternoon. So I'm so excited for this conversation.
I'm so honored to be here with you. Both of you have become friends over the past few years, so I'm grateful to be here. My name is Megan DeWalt, and I am the director of the Institute for Youth Ministry here at Princeton Theological Seminary, where we believe that youth ministry and theology belong to one another, and we do all kinds of work to resource, equip, inspire, and train youth workers. We create resources, we create learning communities, which is part of what Cassandra is referencing. Anyone who does ministry with young people is hopefully served by our institute.
Yeah, well, I have to brag a little bit about you too, Megan, because Megan's also the co-author of the revised edition of The God-Bearing Life, the art is just fantastic, such a powerful spiritual anchor, and just a must read for anyone involved with youth ministry. So I had to brag a little bit about you there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's kind of surreal that book is now out in the world. But yeah, back 20-something years ago, Kenda Creasy Dean and Ron Foster wrote this book that's become really like a primer for doing thoughtful, theologically engaged youth ministry. And I had been assigning it and teaching it as part of our certificate youth and theology program for many years, and realized that it was in need of an update in a couple ways to like reference and recognize the cultural moment that we're living in. So during the pandemic, during the quarantine portion, I spent a lot of long nights just helping to kind of revise and rewrite very substantively this text, and then it was published just in March. So very exciting.
So exciting. That's so awesome. Well, so we're all here together to talk about some of the findings of Navigating Injustice, and I'm really excited to do that. I just want to kind of start off here with a little bit of background about the origins of how this project came to be. So for those who don't know, Springtide is a nonprofit organization that conducts research in the social science, and we focus specifically on understanding and improving the spiritual flourishing of adolescents and young adults ages 30 to 25. And that means we're usually working with like really big data sets that are representative and give kind of like this bird's eye view, or like this big picture in broad strokes about what's going on with young people today. But, you know, as social scientists, we know that everything from beliefs to their values, their behaviors, and so on is really shaped in large part by their social location. Is a term that we use to think about where people fit relative to other people on the social landscape across really important kind of markers or characteristics like gender and class, ability, region, race, and ethnicity. And so this past summer, we got to do a deeper dive into how race and ethnicity in particular shape some of those experiences and outcomes. And we were especially really interested in how it shaped mental health. And so the result of that summer research that Cassandra and I got to work on turned into this publication called Navigating Injustice, which is what I'm talking about today. And I also have the privilege of leading an online seminar at Theological Seminary's Institute for Youth Ministry this coming May. So excited about that. And registration is still open. So we'll put all of the information up on that in case you're interested in joining us there in May. So that was my long kind of setup. But Cassandra, why don't we just get into it? Can you tell us what some of the most surprising and interesting findings were for you as you worked on this project?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Nabil. So for those of you all that may not know, in addition to being a researcher, I'm also a youth minister. So I was really excited about this project. And I was actually surprised by a number of things. The first research finding that was somewhat, I think that challenges the misconceptions of BIPOC Gen Z's faith is that there's this narrative that they're disengaged from their faith. So despite this narrative, what we learned as a consequence of navigating injustice research, that a lot of Gen Zs are not disengaged in faith as well. So that was one thing I think that we need to understand, that Gen Z, they're not disengaged from their faith and spiritual practices, despite all the narratives that, you know, the church is going to die, the young people don't want to be a part of the church, young people are not religious, and so forth. So I think that's really important. And when I say BIPOC, I'm specifically referring to Black, Indigenous, people of color, including Latinos and Asian Americans as well, or people, not Asian Americans, but Asian individuals or groups.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Cassandra.
Yeah. So I said all that to say, in the Navigating Injustice report, if you don't have it, you'll kind of see some of our major findings, but there's some that I think that we weren't able to share that I think would be a great opportunity to hear from Meg and her perspective on. One surprising finding is that most BIPOC Gen Z that we interview, that, as I mentioned, they hold on to their spiritual practices, meaning that they're still praying, they're still meditating, they're listening to faith-inspiring music, and they're reading the Bible or whatever it is, the sacred text. However, even though that they're holding on to these spiritual practices, they're holding on to these spiritual practices not because they're strictly religious, but because they're considered familiar or ethnic cultural. So I think was a surprising finding, that even though many of the BIPOC Gen Z that we interview may not affiliate with their religious faith tradition, that there are many of them that still hold on to these spiritual practices because of the cultural as well as the familiar aspect of that. So that's one finding, Megan, that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. And another finding that I thought was really interesting is that many BIPOC Gen Z spoke candidly about how their faith tradition has been used to justify racial oppression against their people. So even though there are many of them that still identify as Christian, which was the predominant faith tradition that many of the BIPOC Gen Z ascribe to, they did understand that tension between, hey, this religion was used to oppress my people, but at the same time, there's something about it that I'm drawn to. And what we learned is that a lot of Gen Z BIPOC are not just subscribing to, for example, Christianity because of tradition. It's because this particular religion has given them the spiritual tools such as prayer, meditation, scripture to navigate racial oppression and affirm their cultural identity. So I guess all I'm trying to say is that both of these findings suggest that BIPOC Gen Z respective ethnic cultures impact their religious beliefs. In other words, their respective ethnic cultures shape how they think about and experience religious concepts like God, prayer, justice, and different ritual practices. So I know I said a mouthful, but Megan, what are your thoughts in terms of, like, I guess, theological implications of what we're seeing Gen Z BIPOC share with us, as well as have other ministers or those that work, other faith leaders that work with you, have they shared similar findings as well?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the mouthful, Cassandra. It's actually really helpful. I loved reading through Navigating Injustice, and I think that the work that you guys are doing to sort of to elevate and center BIPOC young people's voices in your research it's unique. I think the approach that you're taking, and it's really critical to kind of make sure that we're amplifying what's really going on the ground. Apologies for just a tech question, but can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, great.
Okay. I'm just making sure I'm coming in loud and clear. So now that I'm thinking through some of the questions that you were asking, Cassandra, in some of these findings, and I think the first thing that I want to do is really affirm these findings that BIPOC Gen Z are defying the stereotypes of being disengaged from faith and spiritual practices, where I think that leaders of churches and Christian communities, which tends to be my context the most, often miss the boat is when they they only confer a kind of theological legitimacy on the faith and spiritual practices that are happening and that occur inside the four walls of a church, or even like the metaphorical four walls of like a church-sponsored activity of some kind. And the reality, as you've discovered in your research, is that for many young people, many of these spiritual practices don't require the official sanctioning of the church. So a young person can pray, can read the Bible, can listen to music anywhere. And what we're finding in our work is that there's this gap between how churches often imagine youth ministry and then therefore how they're writing their job descriptions based on a kind of model of youth ministry that was prevalent in the 1980s and 90s, and where young people today actually live and move and have their being and engage and connect spiritually. And so, for instance, one of the things that we know is that Gen Z is acutely aware of the existential threats that are facing their generation. Blame that on or credit that to social media or other ways of connecting and communicating, but Gen Z folks, they know about school shootings and other forms of gun violence that impact their lives and their communities. They're deeply aware of the existential threats posed by climate change, by those posed by racial injustice, by the attempted eradication of trans and non-binary identities. And this list goes on and on. They're deeply aware of these kinds of injustices. And these young people are saying that the church, by and large, is either silent on these issues. Sometimes the church is wholly absent from these conversations. Sometimes it's hostile particularly about these kinds of areas. And often what we're finding is that churches tend to kind of fall in this wishy-washy ground between these two polarities, where they're often just so wrapped up in the narrative of decline and their fears around that the church gives off this really like weird and desperate energy for, the presence of young people in their midst. And it can be really off-putting and suspicious, to young people. So to actually live out their expression of faith, young people aren't waiting on the church anymore. They're doing it themselves. They're creating communities of belonging. They're engaging in, as you said, faith-based and spiritually grounded practices, including acts of justice and peacemaking, which is really central to much of how they understand their faith to be lived out in the world. And they're doing it without the stamp of approval from churches, because at this point, why would they even need it? A second resonance that I wanted to lift up from the research that you mentioned and from some of your surprising findings is that there is this deep resonance between your findings on the relational aspects of faith practices among families and communities and what research into the faith of young people has found for now over 30 years. And there was a landmark national study on youth and religion that's now about 15 years old, but it emphasized in its findings again and again the importance, the centrality of parents and caregivers as the primary spiritual influence on young people. And then the Pew Research Center and other Barna and other groups, they've been surveying the religious landscape of young people for years. And they have found, again, the same sort of pattern of the importance of parents and caregivers as the primary spiritual influence. Many thought leaders in the youth ministry world have created resources or written books trying to get this to saturate the consciousness of the youth ministry landscape through, things like family-based youth ministry models or intergenerational models of formation. Our own research here at the Institute for Youth Ministry has found, in our most recent grant project, for instance, that faith and spiritual formation with young people, it happens in a kind of ecology where there are relationships in a community that span across generations. So what your research really showed, it kind of affirms a lot of that to me, but it also illuminates two things. The first is that I think it's really important for youth ministry to be a place that equips and empowers parents and caregivers so that they understand themselves as the transmitters of faith. Now, I'm here at Princeton Seminary, so I also have to say that in the Reformed theological tradition, we understand that to be God's work is the one who create God's own work creates faith in the lives of young people and all of us. But we do have a role to play, and parents and caregivers certainly have a role to play in being kind of conduits for this sort of faith transmission. However, we also see very often in churches, especially in predominantly white middle-class ones, that although I guess I could say that this pattern does sometimes exist in BIPOC churches as well, it's this kind of professionalization of youth ministry that has taken hold of the youth ministry landscape, and of which the IYM and organizations like ours maybe have played a role in creating this. But it's this professionalization that I think gives parents and caregivers this illusion that just dropping your kids off at church into the hands of the professionals should result in some kind of lifelong faithful Christian discipleship, when I speak of my tradition, but a lifelong sort of formation according to one tradition. There's kind of an ROI in that investment. They drop them off and then the transaction should yield these lifelong faithful Christians. But in fact, I think we have a lot of work to do, and your research helps to show that, in forming families and communities who understand that there's a collective role that we all play as conduits of faith. And this is something that we also see much more prevalent and organic happening in BIPOC communities, of which BIPOC Gen Z, as your research shows, have really benefited. And the second point, and this may be controversial, but I'm going to throw it out there on the gram.
Love it.
And we're going to see what happens. But what your research kind of indicates to me, and this sort of hypothesis that I have, is that there is actually tremendous value in parents and caregivers continuing to heavily encourage, if not require, that their young people participate in the life of the church or faith community. If that's a value for parents and caregivers, then that's something that I think they can play a role in really helping to require. So the disclaimer there is, I'm obviously not saying that I think young people should be forced to attend churches or faith communities that are unsafe or abusive or harmful in any way. And there are sadly many of those, right? But what I am suggesting is that your research makes me consider how familial or ethnic and cultural practices are also formative for young people as they continue to develop a sense of identity and belonging. And I think many BIPOC communities already do this and are doing this. And there are a lot of historical and cultural reasons for why this has become, an essential part of identity formation for young people. Now, you said that you had a mouthful, but here we go. My last point about what your research shows is just the absolute necessity of ongoing truth-telling, of ongoing reckoning with the harms that have been done in the name of Jesus throughout Christian history, and meaningful, actionable forms of repentance that actually cultivate the kind of change in communities that young people want to see. And the recognition, that your research had about how BIPOC young people are deeply aware of the problematic ways that the church has and Christian identity has harmed communities for kind of throughout its existence. We have to be brave enough, courageous enough to name those truths, to learn and unlearn patterns and ways of knowing. And there are a lot of rich theological traditions that already do this. The emergence of things like the womanist theological tradition, the feminist theological tradition, indigenous forms of knowing and spirituality, these kind of decolonized theological and hermeneutical approaches, they help. They bring out so much from the rich cultural wells, which was actually how Christianity was initially spread, was the encountering of other cultures and sort of the making sense of what happens when the message of Jesus hits these other local communities. This is part of the gospel of Jesus. So Christianity has to have a reckoning with the harms done in the name of Jesus throughout Christian history if it has any hope of actually connecting with young people, and particularly with BIPOC Gen Z.
No, definitely, Megan. That was, even though that was a mouthful, there's so many things that I take away. One thing that I took away, and I think St. Luke Memphis put it in the comment, is this whole notion of we can't force, we can't convince teens to come to church. Mm-hmm. And I think the familiar aspect is even important, but also providing opportunities, as you mentioned, for them to see themselves as a part of the faith community. And I think a lot of that has to do with the truth telling, as well as kind of reimagining. So that's what I love so much about the Institute of Youth Ministry. It's like reimagining, because some of us, and I don't know if anyone that's tuning in, those of us that serve as youth ministers, we hold on. It's just like there's like this nostalgia, like, well, when I was in youth ministry back in the day,
oh yeah,
we always came to church on Saturday, Sunday, and it's like now you're like pulling teens to come to church. It's like, no, like that was our generation, and we need to be mindful of what the needs of this generation. I appreciate you really stamping and reminding us that the familiar piece, especially for BIPOC Gen Z, critical. Like families have to be involved. There's no way you can have that old youth ministry model where you just drop your kids off. Like families are just important as well. So I thank you for stamping that. And then the second thing before wrapping up that I want to talk about is where you were talking about the truth telling. So something that Nabil and I and the rest of the Navigating Injustice team saw was that a number of BIPOC Gen Z talked about the importance of truth telling, but not only truth telling, but really being about what they say they are, right? So instead of saying that, Black Lives Matter or whatever the case may be, what are the ways the church is using its resources, its time, privilege to actually be about that change that they desire, right? So I think that truth telling is one part, as well as, actually doing the work. A lot of Gen Z, I think of a phrase like, where are your receipts? Gen Z wants to see receipts, right? Gen Z doesn't want you to just say you're about it and you're not about it. And I think that leads us to this whole concept of spiritual bypassing, right? Mm-hmm. So a number of times when we had a lot of these conversations with Gen Z BIPOC, they were just saying that, like people just avoid talking about race. People just avoid talking about social injustice. Mm-hmm. And a lot of churches fall into this victimhood of spiritual bypassing. Right. And that's really like, the guise of using your spiritual beliefs, and because you don't want to engage with the discomfort that might arise. And there's a lot of different ways that spiritual bypassing shows up, especially for BIPOC Gen Z that find themselves in predominantly white faith churches, and I would even throw it out there, in homogeneous faith institutions look like themselves, right? This whole concept of there is no color, we are all one. Mm-hmm. Talking about racism is divisive. Let's just focus on God, right? And I think something that we need to be mindful of about spiritual bypassing is that it robs individuals and faith communities the opportunity for spiritual growth.
That's right.
Avoid not having these conversations, especially with this BIPOC Gen Z that are experiencing so much from COVID, from mass shootings. It just seems as though, like, it has become the norm that the church or faith communities in general need to provide Gen Z the opportunity to kind of reconcile and make sense of what what is going on, not only for spiritual growth, but also to raise the collective consciousness that calls us to do more. So I think Gen Z is really pushing all of us to really be mindful of, okay, our faith says these are our values, but how are we living out our values?
Yep.
So based on our conversation and even thinking about ways that we can overcome spiritual bypassing, I think one thing, and you said it before as well as Nabil, that we can do that may be scary is model courageous behavior.
That's right.
I think this is a time and day and age that we cannot remain neutral. Neutrality is basically you're saying you're siding with the oppressor. And I think that Gen Z, BIPOC are requiring and demanding that those of us that say we're with them to model their courageous behavior. They're the ones out in the streets. They're the ones holding people accountable. They're the ones signing petitions, right? We can't say that we're for them if we're not counting the cost as well, right? Because they have counted the cost and they're like, the cost is fine. I need to do what I need to do. And that just makes me think of what Dr. King has said. And I'm going to wrap up in terms of when he says the hottest place in hell is reserved for those who remain neutral of great moral conflict, right? So that an individual who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it. And I'm just grateful that Gen Z, BIPOC are putting us to the forefront and asking us, like, you say this is what you believe in. Can you be with us? Can you put something on the line as well? So I think as youth workers, and again, it's uncomfortable, especially with the politics, the polity of fake traditions to put ourselves out there. But Gen Z is asking for it in order for us to be in solidarity with them. And lastly, and I think that requires us to be vulnerable. I think as adults, we always want to seem like we have it together. But I think Gen Z, they admire and they respect the vulnerability and the learning journey that we take in order to do so. So I just wanted to just put that out there as well.
Cassandra, that was so well said. I
so
mean,
good.
Like, just full stop. This was such an amazing conversation. I'm so grateful that we were able to get here together today and talk about some of these things and share the findings, that, you know, the theological implications of the findings, but also what we can do with the findings in our ministry and our young people going forward. Because I think there's a lot of nervousness around this. You know, Megan, you mentioned people are focused on the numbers in the pews. That makes a lot of sense to me. And people are wondering, you know, if I broach some topics, will I, you know, am I risking the new people that I have here that I desperately want to? It's kind of that desperate posturing you were talking about. But like, the fact of the matter is, like you said, Megan, like you said, Cassandra, young people, they're already tuned in. They know about it, whether or not you're going to accompany them in thinking about it or not. Right. And they're already holding these in tension. They're already holding the realities of the church's role in the oppression of minoritized racial groups and genuinely held religious beliefs and practices in tension. And that should be, I think, kind of hope inducing a little bit, is that they're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And so, like Cassandra said, are you gonna go them? Are you gonna walk? Because they're kind of modeling the courageous and vulnerability for us.
100%.
So
I just noticed, you know, as you're talking about kind of the courage and the risk that is needed from us adults who are in these positions of power. I just see that there's a comment and a question around, you know, how do we do this kind of work without getting fired? And that's a real concern. And I work with youth workers from around the country who are navigating this big question. And I don't have well, you do these 3 kind of steps and that guarantees, but I do think there is a deep need for the relational work that has to test, you know, youth workers themselves, I think, are also in that tension of needing to navigate both the the reality of standing firm in solidarity with your young people and doing the hard, long relational work of cultivating relationship and connection with the powers that be that are maybe standing on the necks of others. But there's something, you know, there's a moment and a time to draw a line and to take a stand. I mean, I think that in the Christian tradition, we see that in how Jesus lives out Jesus's own ministry. We're in the middle of Holy Week as we speak, and thinking through the journey that Jesus takes to the cross. And, you know, Jesus wasn't arrested for being a nice guy that made people feel good all the time. Jesus was arrested as a political prisoner because of the work that he did in society. And, you know, that led to capital punishment. There is something there that we like to gloss over. We like to spiritually bypass even our own narratives around our theological traditions, and we really need to take seriously what it means to be believers in this kind of a gospel story. So I just wanted to add that in as I see the difficult question. And friend who's here joining us and asking that question, I just prayers with you and solidarity with you in that struggle.
Yeah, is it okay before we end? I just want to add something that you said, Megan. In terms of resistance, because I felt that way working at a school for a few years. Like, I think resistance doesn't have to be like something like a grand gesture, but it could just be just providing the space. So what I like to think of it in an education, we call kind of like a second classroom, right? Like, so of course, not like hiding what you're doing, but like when you're in that community, like providing that space to wrestle. I think that's something also, like, I think we need to have these grand gestures to show in solidarity, but just in terms of when you are with the youth, are you a safe space, right? And I know that, and I'm being careful with that. Like, do you provide them, do you hold space for them that they feel comfortable having these conversations with you? And I think a lot of that work can empower youth where it doesn't seem like your livelihood is on the line. And I'm just speaking from my experience as a teacher in institutions where they don't want to talk about these things, just giving them that space. And it's not really a cop-out, but I think that's important for us to remind, just being present. And that in itself, and just holding that space is also a sign of resistance too.
I love that, Cassandra. It's so true. And I'll bring the social science in one last time. As a social scientist is, you know, we even see in the research the impact of one trusted adult in life. One trusted adult who can provide that space to wrestle, as you put it, Cassandra, goes such a long way in belonging, in a number of welcomes. I mean, the list goes on and on. So what a powerful way to end this session. I'm so grateful to have been, you know, in conversation with you both today. Really appreciate your insights and the work you both are doing to better serve young people today. So if you want to learn more about Springtide, visit our website at springtideresearch.org and follow us pretty much on any kind of social media there is out there at We Are Springtide. So Megan, what's the best way for people to stay connected to your work at PTS?
Yeah, well, please follow us on Instagram, and we're also on Facebook, our handle at Princeton Seminary IYM. We are not on every form of social media because I can only handle about 2 right now. We'll see. And even then, sometimes it's overwhelming. So also, please check out our website. It's just iym.ptsem.edu. You can subscribe to our newsletter there where we announce the latest announcements, news, resources, opportunities to connect with us. And please come to the forum on youth ministry. If you join us online, it's going to be May 2nd through 4th. If you join us online, you get to hear the brilliant and talented Nabil give her continued brilliance in her online seminar. But there are plenty of spaces to also please join us in person here on the beautiful campus of Princeton Theological Seminary. And there's another roster of amazing leaders at this event. So come out and join us.
That is for sure. Thank you, Megan. And I'll see you all tomorrow.
Sounds good. Bye, friends.